Suman, hey, you're on mute.
Sorry, hi, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you? All good?
Doing good. All good, all good. Meeting after a while.
Yes, exactly. Nice to bump into each other again.
I know, I know.
Hi, Sandesha. Welcome to Words to Avoid and welcome to the circle. Hey, Somesh, welcome. Suman, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. So if you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about one of the words, right? Which is but. And it was titled, You Did a Good Job,
Yes,
but.
that was a
And I
great
think we
one.
were
Yeah.
talking in the context of, yeah, and we were talking in the context of giving negative feedback. So I thought, maybe we'll build on that. And there are a whole bunch of other things that we can avoid saying. So for some of you for some of the listeners who've not been part of that, essentially what we were saying is the moment we use the word but, it negates all that was said before that, right? So we use the sandwich technique, and we said, let's try and avoid that. And like but, there are other words also which you can avoid. And it need not be only for negative feedback or difficult situations. But before we jump in and discuss the other words, I think I want to say something, right? See, often it is about framing, like you said. Remember, Divya? It's about reframing the statement.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the way we reframed but was with and. And one of the examples we said is, your presentation went well, but you should have prepared better. As opposed to that, we just say your presentation went well, and you may want to prepare better for audience questions, right? Essentially, just changing the word "but" and replacing it with "and." Now, one can argue that this is about technique, right? It can sound a bit scripted, because of which I might say, you know what, I don't want to do that. I don't want to change the way I speak. I can even justify that by saying, that's just me being authentic, right? I don't want to do
Correct.
that. But the point is, and I think we missed this, the point is it is really about avoiding a fight or flight response, which is the stress response, right? And we talked about that. Essentially, that is about the adrenal glands producing some of these hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. And we get into this hijack mode, right? The amygdala hijack. So yeah, it can be seen as just reframing or scripting, but there is a reason why we do that, and reframing definitely helps soften the impact.
I completely agree, Suman. I think you talked about the stress response, right? And I think we touched upon this, the previous circle, that it stood us in very, very good stead, right? There were predators. The stress response was excellent, temporary response so that our body could get the hell away from there or fight, right? Essentially, that's
Yeah.
why, fight or flight response. And over time, the things that we have learned to respond negatively to, or the things that have become stressors, have become softer and softer and softer and more cognitive, right? It has become, look at all the anxiety disorders and so on and so forth, right? A lot of the
Yeah.
stressors are social, a lot of the stressors are cognitive in the sense that they're imagined, right? They're stressors of in anticipation of getting fired, or in anticipation of everything is just so terrible. It's that feeling of dread, right, that causes stress.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the what you're talking about today is super important, right? Because language is one of those things that can cause cognitive stressors, and that can become cognitive stressors, right? Like the word but during a feedback, and I'm sure we can think of 20 other words, even during conversation, that start the alarm bells in our heads, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And these
Yeah.
alarm
Yeah.
bells are a learned response, and it's also because of how we narrate, or how we remember, past experiences or negative experiences. But I think it's a fascinating subject, and let's talk about some of these words that evoke the stress response.
Great. Great. Yeah, I also feel very strongly about this. To me, this is really about connecting with empathy, communicating with empathy, which goes to the heart of emotional intelligence.
Yep, absolutely. So let's talk about, what are the words you have in mind, Suman? What are some of the other words that we need to talk? Nancy says, oh my God, Nancy, I can't tell you the number of times when somebody has said that and then they would disappear. and I'll be sitting on the other end of the phone or the other end of whatever saying, can you please just not leave me hanging? Can you tell me what you're talking about? But absolutely, that's a big one. Yeah, but yeah, Suman.
Yeah, it is. That's a nice start, Nancy. You're absolutely right. These words by itself, they seem harmless, right? But the moment someone hears we need to talk, oh my God, is I think one of the most ominous phrases. We are conditioned to interpret this as real bad news.
Yeah, alarm bell.
Yeah. And what happens if I come back and say, okay, but let's talk about it later? I think it now hits the alarm bells on the other side, right? The moment you want to postpone something for later means, oh my God, there's something which is really big or catastrophic.
Absolutely. And Suman, that word catastrophic, let's come back to that. But let's talk about some of the words first. But I want to come back to that catastrophic word. I think it's a very...
Sure. So do you want me to just pick a few and just go
Yeah,
along?
let's take a look at some of the words, and let's maybe, we can talk about how it's been used and how we've responded to it maybe.
So let's say I'm in a meeting and somebody talks to me in a certain way and I didn't like it. And I think I'm being very controlled about it. I don't do anything in the meeting, but I come back and I confront this person and say, why did you do this? Why did you speak to me like this in the meeting? Now, what I'm doing is, and of course, you can see that it's a little higher pitch. And if I was in front, maybe my body language would show differently, my finger pointing, all of that, right? It's a threat. The other person feels attacked, right? And that's when the amygdala hijack happens. And because if it's a fight or flight, what you would see is a counterattack or the person might get defensive. Yeah. Now, this is something that's happened to me. Let's take another situation where it's not happened to me, but I've heard from somebody else. Hey, why did you send out a note to the customer without discussing it with me? Hey, why did you go and speak to that guy? Now, the first one is definitely triggering a stress response. The second one, there's one more problem, is that I'm making an assumption, right? I'm making an assumption about something and I'm accusing the other person instead of doing a reality check. Maybe he didn't send a note. Maybe he was just sending a holding message. Maybe he didn't go and speak to the other person, but the other guy called, and which is why they had that conversation. I don't know. So it's important to understand the reality, right? So it could be rephrased as, hey, I heard something, but I want to know your reality, your views. Like, tell me what's happened here. I think that's important. And often we kind of, especially when our alarm bells are going on, when we are in a high adrenaline mode, we tend to attack more, and in response we get a counterattack or defensive behavior. So one of the ways to contain that is to use a neutral tone, right? So emotional containment is very important. You contain it, not that we are stuffing it. Now I can say, instead I can say, I'm really, really upset right now, and let me tell you why I'm upset. And I want to have a productive conversation, but I'm really angry right now. So maybe now is not the time. See, anger or upset, these are all powerful emotions. So it's good to show it. I don't think it's a good idea to completely kind of cover it up. But when it's used with restraint and when I'm not going off the rails, it can be a very powerful tool. See, actually, what I'm saying is also quite powerful. I'm saying, look at the entire conversation. I'm saying, hey, I felt upset and I'm really upset right now. Let me tell you why I'm upset. Yeah. And so we are having a conversation, isn't it? And the other person clearly understands that he or she did something which kind of triggered something in me. Is that making sense?
Yeah, absolutely is, Suman. Prudent, I see you've joined the conversation. Do you want to add to it?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shekhar, and I am basically a native of Prayagraj, Uttar Pradesh. And currently, I am pursuing my master's from IIT Kharagpur in intellectual property law.
Lovely.
And and I like I'm very feeling very grateful to hear you all, and I'm enjoying this conversation.
Excellent. Happy
Great.
to jump in whenever you have any thoughts, Prudent. But Shekhar, sorry. But Suman, I think that was such an important point that you just made, right? And also, it also, because think of the person that is listening to the why, right? One is about you, but the person, like you said, it triggers alarm bells and it puts them in the back foot, right? On the defensive right away, right? Why would you do this? Puts the recipient on the back foot, on the defensive, and everything they're doing there, right? Everything they're doing from then on is for, in the olden state of things, for survival, right? At that point, it is catastrophic for that person, where they're thinking, oh my God, now it is the end, right? What should I do? I have to rationalize the situation, and I have to kind of, save myself, right? So think about the emotions. Like you said, I might say, I want to be authentic, but you're not being empathetic at all if you don't even realize that that other person is going through a catastrophic response at that point, right, Suman?
Absolutely. And I think in the overall context of leadership, that's why I find this topic so interesting, is that we have all these buzzwords and we often kind of use one buzzword to cover for something else, right? And probably authentic is one of the most abused ones in my view, right? I just feel I'm abused. I'm just authentic, and because of which I can do whatever I want to do or have been doing, and using that to kind of convince myself that I don't need to change.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think another one of those words, right, Suman, and Viraj, my Hindi is not very great, but I can try. But another word that we use a lot, and जो खुद के लिए नहीं, but others के लिए थोड़ा stressful हो सकता है, is the word should, right? Suman, it used to be you should have or you shouldn't have, and that was enough, right? But now there is this, if you notice, there's a softer version of this word, which is, it's essentially saying you should, but people say we should. We should really do this next time, but it's meant to be you should do this next time, right? Or we should have gotten that done, which means you should have gotten that done, right? So I think that's the other one, which is the word should. And, I'd love to hear your thoughts on should.
I think that's you're absolutely right about should, and the way you reframed it as to we should definitely takes the edge out, right? Because then suddenly it's not only about the other person. So I think that's a great strategy. At the same time, can we avoid the word should? We can. Yeah. If somebody says you should do this, the first thing I'm thinking is, who the hell are you? Who are you to advise me? Did I ask for your advice? So all kinds of thoughts to get triggered in the head, right? Because it's an amygdala hijack, right? So it can be even for a small thing like calling the client, right? As opposed to saying you should call the client, I can just say you may want to call the client, right? Even if I know the answer, I feel I know the answer, maybe I'm more experienced. So instead of saying you should immediately respond to that email, I can just tweak it a bit and say, I can say, I'll appreciate if you just send an email to that client, right? Or I can take a coaching approach. I can say, hey, have you considered doing this, and give an idea. The idea is, the person still feels in control. There is still a sense of autonomy. They feel they're taking the decision as opposed to something being imposed on them, right? Because nobody likes to be told what to do, right? It doesn't matter in which situation you are. Even if you're the boss, don't do it, because fundamentally people like to believe that they're making their own choices. No one likes to be told, and that too authoritatively, what they need to do.
Absolutely. And I think, Nancy makes a very good point. Nancy, feel free to jump in at any point, right? Where, Suman, one of the other hacks to do this is to not make the person the subject of what you're speaking, right? Where we've said this even with but, right? And you've said even with why, if you make the email or the problem at hand, or, the lack of communication, or the missing thing in the presentation, the subject, and not a personal comment on the person, right? It's not about the person, it's about the situation. I think there you're not evoking shame, and you're evoking better and more reparative kind of emotions, right? Because the minute you make the person the subject, you're evoking shame, which is super stressful. Shame is just another type of stress response, right? Because
Absolutely. So, since we are talking of rephrasing or reframing, like we said, let's use and instead of but. Even for this why thing, I think there could be a slightly different way. We can replace the why with the what, because the why itself can be triggering a bit, Right? So let's take this example. Why did you do this? Instead, I can say, what made you take this decision or take this step, right? So I'm just replacing why with a what. So that can be powerful. And if you just look at this question, why did you do this? Sometimes the emphasis on you, why did you do this, which can also be a big threat, right? And there, I think we can turn the you to an I, and this is extremely powerful, right? For instance, instead of saying you should not have done this, I can say, to what I experience or what I feel. Let's take an example. Why did you speak to me like that in the meeting? Let's say the person said something which I didn't like. So
Right.
instead of saying, why did you speak to me like that in the meeting? I can just say, I felt the comment that you made in that meeting that my idea was useless was a bit demeaning. Maybe you didn't mean it, but I found it upsetting. Advantage is when I'm talking of one is I'm diffusing conflict and I'm not escalating it. And the other person cannot attack me because I'm expressing my feelings, right? It's about myself. I can show my emotion. And I can say, you know what, this happened in the morning and I found it was demeaning. I got angry and I withdrew, and that's why I'm speaking to you now when this happened 2 days ago. I can say, I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to deal with you, which is also showing a bit of vulnerability, right? Say what I want, right? I mean, I want to say what I want. I would appreciate if you speak to me in a respectful way, and I want us to have a good professional relationship, have a mutually respectful relationship. If you see, I'm making a lot of forceful statements, but I'm doing it in a way that my point is going across, but at the same time, it's not threatening to the other person.
I love that. I love the using the I more and the you less. I think that itself is such a good shortcut, right? Suman, make it less about the other person. Also make it more about how you're feeling. But Sharjeel said in the chat that, a lot of these tips and things work for the corporate environment and not so much in chef life. And I'm really curious to know more. Sharjeel, give me an example.
Yeah. So, okay, before I give the example, let me just preface it by saying there's a difference between a conversation and an order. In a kitchen, you get ordered around a lot, especially at the lower rungs, right? You're not being asked to think, you're not being asked to have a conversation, you're being asked to get things done. That's the only thing. And sometimes, and I think everyone has seen Gordon Ramsay and like other chefs who get angry. That's roughly how a lot of kitchens operate. I'm not saying all of them, but a lot of them operate that way, right? And at that point, you also understand that it's such a high pressure situation in a kitchen that you sort of you automatically remove all the abuses in your head. And when there is a serious conversation to be had with the chef, unless you've done something ridiculous that you get fired on the spot for, the chef after the shift comes to you and there's a more human conversation then. So I'd always say in the heat of the moment, maybe there's not, words to avoid might be hard because you're being as emotional and vulnerable because that's the setting. But that mature conversation has its own space, and I think in office culture, like now that I work on a different field all in itself, it's just about I can't tell my juniors to get shit done. I have to be highly polite and be like, oh, okay, I have to go around these, navigate these political correctness things about, it would be helpful if you could send this email by tomorrow. And I don't mind doing it, but I just feel like I just want to be like, dude, just get it done. That's about it. That's all that needs to be said. But I definitely feel words to avoid it. It's laced with intent as well, right? I'm not trying to intend to hurt you when I say get it
So
done.
let me quickly give you a
So
response
that's the
here,
point.
Sharjeel, because you've just got 2 minutes left. I agree with you that it's very difficult to do, and that's why emotional containment is incredibly hard. It requires tremendous amount of practice. But let's all agree that it's incredibly important to do. And I think it has nothing to do with whether it's at work, whether it's in the office, or whether it's at home or in your personal settings. Because essentially you're triggering a stress response in the other person, and nobody likes to be triggered. Nobody likes to be in an high anxiety zone. Okay, so that's the bottom line. Just imagine if I
Yeah,
say, why do you
I
do this?
think I was just
Imagine a fight at home, and you say, hey, and you're telling your spouse, why did you do this? And I'm sure you can guess where it heads after that, the conversation, right? I think it requires self-awareness, and once you have the awareness, you need to build the regulation, and regulation is easier said than done. But I think we need to be cognizant of this and start working on this. Okay, and I think the best way to do is to not to respond immediately in the moment, and I think that goes to mindfulness. sometimes you just take a deep breath, think about what your response should be, and come back, and it will be a very, very different response going forward.
I think this
Does that
is
make sense?
clearly we need to clearly extend this conversation, Suman. We have 8 seconds left, and I'm sure there's other words out
Okay.
there. And also, I think,
Absolutely.
and Sharjit brought up an interesting point, which